I would say in the electricity business, just like any energy business, what will happen in the future is what's happened in the past. Priority will be given to residences. It's no politician is going to let permanent condition occur where the industrial sector gets energy before residences and citizens get it. It won't happen. At least not in a democracy. It can happen in Russia, not here. And even there, they'd have trouble. So that won't be the trajectory. The trajectory will be to figure out how to make enough electricity. And if the industrial sector can't get the electricity they need, they'll go elsewhere, which is what's happening right now, by the way, in Germany. Germany is deindustrializing, as is the United Kingdom, because they're not building enough electric power plants that are reliable. So I'll make a couple predictions. First, the plans for shutting down coal and gas plants will stop. In fact, they'll probably reverse plans, as they already did in Germany. So I think you'll see, however it's packaged politically, the temporary pause, extension, whatever the language is. Well, we're going to stop shutting down reliable power plants.
Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by returning guest, Mark P. Mills. Although, Mark, it has been, I think, over 2 years since you've been on, which is a crime, really.
It's an eternity.
There's a lot. It's an eternity. In Decouple terms, it is. It is. We just celebrated our 4th anniversary back in May. So yeah, we keep on kicking about an episode a week. And no, your 2 episodes were very well received, and we've come a long way since then. So it is great to have you back in the saddle here. I was just reviewing, what you've been up to, and I don't recognize half your affiliations anymore. Executive Director of the National Center for Energy Analytics, distinguished senior fellow at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Of course, you're still involved with the City Journal. I think that's a publication of the Manhattan Institute. So, Mark, why don't you take a moment and catch us up with all of your adventuring these days?
Well, it's the exciting part of the grandchildren, not the business side, but we'll stick to business. So early this year, I launched with the support of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is a state-based think tank. I think it's the biggest state-based think tank in terms of people and resources to put together a national think tank on energy, mainly because there really isn't one. I mean, if you think about the energy domains outside of universities, there's most of the people who do scholarship in energy work inside of a think tank that does lots of other things, which is fine. It's where I was at the Manhattan Institute, and it was a nice home. I'm still, as you say, affiliated. I write a regular column as a contributing editor for the City Journal, great publication. Lots of eyeballs, so it's a great place to tell a story because people pay attention. Which is why you and I do what we do. If people didn't pay any attention, why bother? You sit in an echo chamber, and it's like singing in the shower. Anyway, so we, over the years, I've thought about this, and the colleagues have asked this question: is where is there an energy think tank? The IEA is not a think tank. The EIA, the Energy Information Administration, the U.S. is a quasi think tank. It's a data collecting entity. So bottom line is, with support from the TPPF organization, its back office, with funding from their trustees and other people, foundations that have supported me, we kicked off, announced in March, the National Center for Energy Analytics. We have a board of advisors of, in my opinion, very impressive people, easy to find out about us at the magic website. So you just do energyanalytics.org. You'll see our 8 scholars. We're announcing a new scholar, I think, tomorrow, and we'll be expanding to what I would hope will become a small army of energy scholars to weigh in. And we have on every page of the website, I adopted a mission statement, if you like, which is I stole a quote from Philip K. Dick. And you may, if you're a science fiction fan, remember Philip K. Dick, prolific writer, science fiction in the 60s. A lot of his stories became movies, like Minority Report was his book, his short story, or novella became a movie. Anyway, he said, I thought brilliantly some time ago, he wrote, reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, is still there. So we're a reality-based think tank. We're focused on trying to preach the gospel of reality, which is what I've been focused on my my whole life. So that's why we did it. We'll see. We got some projects that we're going to announce soon, other than the usual things, scholars doing studies and writing op-eds. I have a piece on nuclear energy you may or may not have seen in Focus Quarterly. I decided to start writing about nuclear energy again because now it matters. It hasn't mattered in 2 decades because of a lot of reasons. So I began my energy career in the nuclear industry. So I thought it's a good time to way back in. I began my energy career in the Canadian nuclear industry, as you may or may not recall.
Yeah.
So my introduction to the nuclear debates and the energy debates was in Canada when pre-Three Mile Island, when Canada was debating whether or not they should continue or abandon its nuclear power program over some degree concerns of safety, but primarily concerns about nonproliferation. That was the primary motive that Parliament ordered the Porter Commission hearings to determine whether Canada should proceed. And obviously Canada decided to proceed, but I was involved with that at that time. So it's a long way of saying that the center will look at a lot of things like nuclear energy, natural gas exports, the stability of grids, the debate over the so-called energy transition. You know what my opinion on that is. That there isn't one, but it's okay. People want to ignore data. That's okay. You're allowed to ignore facts, and we'll see. I mean, we've got some, I think, surprising things that we'll be announcing over the coming 6 months to help sort of reset the framing of how to think about and debate about energy. And there's lots of things that people can disagree about, and for substantive reasons or political reasons, perfectly reasonable. But as you know, and I've talked about this many moons ago, I'm a huge fan of trying to have those debates from a sort of fact-based perspective, and then let the opinions flow from the facts.
Right. That's a good order of operations there. So you
Sometimes.
mentioned nuclear. You mentioned nuclear matters again, and I'm guessing part of that has to do with the AI revolution. The word energy crisis was tossed around by Sam Altman not too long ago, saying that AI is going to cause or is causing a new energy crisis. Projections of it's just really skyrocketing demand, and at least in North America. I mean, obviously, with the global picture, there's been increasing additions to electricity grids in places like China and India and other emerging economies, but we've kind of been flatlining in North America. Compute has been going up; it's been getting more efficient. Maybe it's been balancing itself out, but it seems to be surprising maybe everybody but you. I know you've been writing on this topic for some time, that essentially our appetite for information is not satiable. So
Exactly.
yeah, let's dive in and talk a little bit. You wrote a book, I think it's published in 2021, The Cloud Revolution. Convergence of new technologies will unleash a next economic boom in a roaring 2020s. So maybe
Boom.
that's a kind of
Yeah.
starting off. Yeah, boom. Let's talk about the boom.
Well, the title of the book was was deliberate in the sense that the cloud is the most interesting and most consequential new infrastructure in our economy. But the book's about more than the cloud. It's about the cloud's role, both synergistically as a driving force and as an amplifying force in transportation, in basic research, in healthcare, education, entertainment, material science. All these things are interrelated. They've always been interrelated. But the book, the thread is the cloud. And I wrote a lot about the energy appetite of the cloud in the book because as you said, I've been writing about this and studying it for a long time, a couple decades, in fact. So it's kind of there was a Senate hearing for those in your audience in Canada that don't know the U.S. system. It's very much like the parliamentary system. In the sense, you have hearings before committees, and the chairman can call a hearing on a subject. And the Senate chairman of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee called a quasi-emergency hearing for the same reason Sam Altman said what he said. It's an energy crisis. And the reason they called it was that utilities around the United States were reporting staggering increases in forecast demand for electricity, new requests for connection. Not everywhere, but in a lot of regions in the Northeast, the West, Southwest, and South. And a lot of it was from data centers. In fact, the majority of it was data centers. But A lot of it's also from new factories because the United States wants to repatriate its manufacturing for a variety of reasons, mostly good reasons, not always good reasons. But I'm a huge fan of manufacturing. I worked in manufacturing. I love to repatriate manufacturing. And of course, electric vehicles, by definition, have to be plugged in. So there's sort of three vectors that are going on, causing unexpected increase in electric demand in the near future. But the biggest one is data centers, and the line has been it's entirely because of AI. And I've written about this a lot recently as well. AI is the most energy intensive use of silicon ever by a factor of roughly 10. That is the same amount of time spent in compute with regular CPUs and GPUs doing conventional tasks like we're doing now. If you amplify that task with some machine learning and AI, typically you increase the amount of energy used by the computing by tenfold. It could be as little as a double. It could be as much as 100-fold. Depends on the task, but tenfold is not bad. So knowing that, and this is not news, by the way, the AI people have known this for a long time. I mean, if you think about it, the difference between computing chips that run algorithms that are GPU based or tensor based, inference based as opposed to calculation based, is essentially the difference between an airplane and a car. And by that, I don't mean in absolute terms of energy, but in terms of how you use the engine. An airplane engine is running constantly, and you want to minimize the amount of time it's on the ground. It's an expensive asset, but they're always operating. Power plants run 24/7 if you can. Cars don't. The personal car, you turn on and off, you use it when you need it. Most compute is like a car. It consumes energy when you're using it, but not in between. It's not running flat out all the time. Machine learning, both in the inference and both in the learning phase, but especially in the inference phase, when it's trying to infer what's going on, whether it's drawing a picture or answering a question, is running flat out. It uses a lot more electricity per minute. And that's meaningful as you expand it. But it turns out, if you look at the data, AI is not the real reason that this is boom in data center demand. The data center demand was going up already. It's been going up for 2 decades. What happened is, in short, our economies moved along. North America, we finally absorbed what you can do with computing. If you look at the rise of the app economy, which is very recent, the explosion of number of apps. Apps are everybody knows what they are. It's an application-specific program, but that innovation by itself was much more consequential so far than AI, because what that's done is increased the utility of computing. Apps are very useful. So what that did is cause an explosion in the need for data centers, these platforms for apps. Everything about social media is app-based. Everything about the sharing economy is app-based. Uber is app-based. I mean, the list is, there are hundreds, in fact, there are thousands of apps, app platforms, and there are millions of apps now. So what that did is because we finally got computing connectivity good enough, GPS accurate enough, and this has all been improving in the last 2 decades, or incrementally behind the scenes. Compute in the cloud cheap enough that we have this explosion of uses that are actually fun, interesting, or productive. That's what's been driving it. Now, AI is amplifying and accelerating that without any question. But if you look at the absolute demand for electricity from data centers, that's what's driving it. The AI part of the data centers maybe added 10% last year to the total demand. So it wasn't as if AI came along with ChatGPT and, oh, gee, now we need lots of ChatGPT. 10% on a big number is a big number, but it's 10%. And maybe next year it'll be 12, 15% of it. And it'll maybe 20%. It'll keep adding to the base. But right now, the fundamental discovery is that if you build lots of data centers to do lots of useful things that people want, it consumes lots of electricity. Who knew?
Right, right. You mentioned that this construction of this nebulous cloud is actually a lot of physical infrastructure.
Yeah.
Perhaps our most recent great infrastructure build out. Once we built our highways and bridges and ports and airports and roads, but it's one that's invisible. And I mean, I think we're becoming increasingly an energy and materials blind society. We don't learn about these things in school. I was watching a great Ford mini documentary called "A Car Is Born," and this was back in the day when advertising it ripped the Band-Aid off and it showed you they were proud of, blowing up massive amounts of rock to extract the
Yeah,
iron ore and pelletizing it, and
exactly.
their blast
Yeah.
furnaces. And, this was the big vertically oriented beauty. And they wanted to brag about it. The world has fundamentally changed in terms of people's perceptions. And I'll confess myself to be quite blind to this infrastructure you're describing. So I love getting a sort of granular on the ground sense of what exactly it is we're talking about. So maybe you can describe some of these data centers. I've heard them maybe sort of, maybe greenwashed is the wrong word, but data campuses, data foundries. What's the term that you use, and what the hell do these things look like in the infrastructure that ties them all together?
Well, that's a good question because you know the reason words matter. I mean, the things that we learned in elementary school, it sticks and stones. You break your bones. Words can't. Words hurt. When people use words that don't matter, they hurt. They really do hurt. And words also mislead. Phrasing matters. Nomenclature matters. This is why advertising agencies work and politicians work so hard at phraseology. Why they bend over backwards to come up with clever, elliptical, Orwellian names for things. Like in the United States, our Inflation Reduction Act, which will cause a lot of inflation. Inflation Creation Act. So uh, data center doesn't mean anything. It's like calling a I don't know, a skyscraper, I don't know, a vertical strip mall, or a shop. Call it a. I mean, just think that we call the skyscraper something different than a building because it's really different than a regular building. So tall, so many square feet under it, and the word data center finds its roots right in the early computing era, where you had to walk to the build part of the building that had the computing center, and it had the IBM mainframe in it. And you'd walk to it with your to do your work, and maybe if you're lucky, you had a remote terminal. I did when I was at Queen's University. We had a data center with a remote terminal. We called it the computing center. So that word is stuck with us, but it doesn't evoke anything visually useful. Google engineers some time ago, about 15 years ago, uh, coined the phrase warehouse scale computing. And by that, they thought we should think in terms of the data center. It's not evocative enough. Most people know what a warehouse is. It's a really big building. So if I use the phrase warehouse scale computer, then you're thinking that's one honking big computer. It's exactly what a data center is. It's a warehouse sized building, size of a Walmart, or really literally a warehouse, massive building, million square feet in it. And it's by and large has very few humans, maybe a dozen, but it has millions of CPUs and GPUs, tens of thousands of servers, compute servers, storage, memory, in a single giant building. And it's there because, like a power plant, there are economies of scale to putting things together like that. Speed of light actually matters. Even though light seems fast, it's not fast enough for the kind of calculations that go on in computing. Distances of feet matter. You can't do real time data duplication for financial transactions, which is required by law in the Western world. You have to duplicate financial transactions, but you can't do real time duplication if your duplicate data center is more than a couple dozen kilometers away, because the speed of light
Wow.
is is not fast enough to get it actual real time if you're processing millions of transactions a second. So if you can do arithmetic here, figure out how many milliseconds you can tolerate. Not many. So these are really big buildings, and um, how many? And this is what the focus is on, because that's where the platforms reside, if you like. But the buildings themselves are only part of the story. Give context. They have as many square feet typically on these enterprise scale data centers as a skyscraper. You could call a skyscraper an enterprise scale office building, right? When people say there's an enterprise scale data center, what they mean is that instead of a small room with a computer in it in your office, we have a big building. Well, it's like saying instead of having a small office in a strip mall, I have an enterprise class office building, vertical. That's called a skyscraper. There's lots of them in Toronto, in New York. But if you look at them in square feet and count, the world has several hundred, maybe 1,000 enterprise class office buildings, skyscrapers. The world has about 6,000 enterprise class data centers already. An enterprise class data center, same square footage, uses 100 times more power per square foot We're building them at a 10 times the rate as we are skyscrapers. They cost the same to build, interestingly. But if you're the owner, you can rent a square foot of a data center for about 500% more than you can rent a square foot of a skyscraper because of how much economic value there is in a square foot of a computing, warehouse scale computer. So then you have to connect data centers to people and other data centers and our devices and machines. So those networks, the old phrase, the information superhighway, is really apt here. They are information highways, and they are wired and wireless. We have glass cables, copper cables still, and wireless. Wireless are simply invisible cables. You're doing the same thing. And if you count the mileage of all the data centers connecting to all the devices, think of that as it's a network. And compare it to highways, global highways. You can measure all the world's roads collectively, in barely 1,000,000+ miles. It's a lot of miles, but the network, data center networks, are measured in billions of miles. I mean, it's 1,000 times bigger. And yeah, it's a lighter load on the network, but there's a lot more traffic. So these networks carry traffic that we measure in dollars and bytes. So to give the network, the infrastructure context, so I try to think of it in terms of square feet. So in square footage, it's much bigger than all the world's skyscrapers by a factor of 10 and growing at triple the rate. In dollar terms, we're spending more money building infrastructure for the cloud globally, capital, than all the electric utilities in the world are spending combined to build new power plants. It's a lot of hardware, a lot of money. If in energy consumption terms, because the infrastructure of the cloud uses energy, doesn't produce it, it uses roughly twice as much energy as a country of Japan, electricity rather, as a country of Japan, or put in fuel terms, it's bigger than global aviation and growing faster than global aviation in energy consumption terms. AI is going to accelerate that because AI, the analogy that I used in the piece that you might have seen recently was that if you think about the era of computing, which is why I wrote my book, I think we are at the era we're at in computing with the cloud is roughly equal to 1957, 58 for aviation. At that point in aviation, the Boeing 707 was introduced with jet engines. The first commercial jet aircraft was made possible. But at that point, there'd already been 35 years, 3.5 decades of aviation, hundreds of aviation companies, air travel around the world. Overnight mail was already happening. Overnight, it took pretty close. Postal Service was using airplanes already for 20 years to carry mail across country. It was obviously used in warfighting. Aviation was a huge industry, but in the 1957-58 timeframe, the addition of jet engines to the airframes caused an explosion in the use of aviation. That was the modern aviation era. AI is like adding jet engines to the airframe. We are at, call it 1960 roughly, in terms of the growth now coming in compute infrastructure, and compute utility, all the things that aviation brought to the world, not just entertainment, convenience, and commerce. That kind of acceleration, and then more, comes with the cloud, because the cloud is a general purpose technology. Aviation is not, right? Aviation has just a transportation technology. Cloud amplifies transportation, amplifies research, amplifies education. So the infrastructure, by every measure, is astonishingly big. Energy, money, miles, square feet. It's in its infancy. We're at the end of the beginning, not the beginning of the end, which is really crazy when you think about it. And then the energy implications of it are what caused the hearing. So, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to power all this stuff? It would be as if we held hearings in 1964, early in the era of the explosion of global aviation, and people held a hearing to ask where they're going to get the fuel to fly airplanes. Well, make more fuel. The answer would be make more fuel, but you have to make fuel cheap, because the cost of flying, about a third of it's in the cost of the fuel. And we're now moving to an era where the cost of computing will become like flying. Half, anywhere from a quarter to a third of the cost of computing can end up being associated with the cost of fueling the compute, not buying the chips. Chips get commoditized fast. Power plants are very hard to commoditize. This is sort of the asymmetry that I wrote about in my book. the physics of producing information and the demand for information are exotic and weird. The physics of producing energy are well known, not exotic. They're also weird, but they're highly limited. There aren't many. Uh, there's no Moore's law in energy production, whereas there's a Moore's law, if you like, in energy in information production.
So I just wanted to tug on a couple threads. You were talking about, compute not being the speed of light being too slow, and so inferring, at least for certain kinds of important transactions, financial ones you were mentioning, the need for a distribution of data centers. I know. I remember hearing 10, 15 years ago that Iceland was, attracting a lot of data centers. It's cold there,
Still
easy
is. So is
cooling,
Norway.
and
Yeah, yeah.
plentiful. But is there also a need to sort of, just like cell towers, plug these things in a distributed enough network that they can move close to the speed of light and make those transactions happen? Or can you sort of, regionalize? And another thing I've heard is that certain jurisdictions are saying, we don't want to have a data center here. You're going to use up all our power. You're going to create 12 jobs. Why would I do this for my constituents? So to what degree is that distribution necessary?
Well, the latter point for the latter point you make is what happens when any industry gets to scale. You end up with the classic NIMBY problem, right? Even if it's not about power, it's big things take up space, resources, land, and energy, and some people don't like it, and so you have to deal in a democracy with you know compromises. Either move it, pay higher taxes, make it look pretty, bury it. There's lots of solutions, but they all cost money, and that's sort of where the industry is now in many jurisdictions. Ireland banned the connection to the grid of new data centers because a fifth of all Ireland's electricity is now used to power data centers. This is quite remarkable. And the complaint was the data centers were getting to use all the good electricity, wind and solar, and the citizens couldn't use the were being deprived of that opportunity. This is kind of infantile arguments because electricity is fungible and gets commoditized on grids anyway. But I get the concern. I understand that, but economic growth. What people are forgetting is that data centers epitomize the key feature of modern economies. Economic growth requires more energy. The fact you pointed out earlier that the electric demand growth has been slow, very slow in the last 15 years in North America, is not because we shouldn't expect it to rise again. I've been predicting it would rise again. It's because of a related phenomenon. Our economic growth was relatively slow, slower than it should have been, for a variety of reasons, both predictable and unpredicted. That is, recessions and the like. Uh, and also what I would call anti-growth policies, both governments episodically. I'm not talking necessarily about the ruling parties today, but episodically over the last 15 or 20 years, both Canada and the United States have implemented policies that are anti-growth. Excessive regulations that make it very difficult for businesses to function here, so they go elsewhere. They go to China, they go to Indonesia, they go to Vietnam. But some of that's reversing. But also, most importantly, and this is relevant to computing and everything else, all efficiency gains and reducing the amount of energy you need, electricity you need to do lighting, to do air conditioning, to cook, to heat. We've had tremendous technology efficiency gains across the board and the things that we use in industries and at home. And those efficiency gains have been really remarkable the last 20 years. A part of that's been driven by regulations. Most of that's been driven by normal technology progress. We find what engineers do in every domain is they always seek to compete by making whatever they built more efficient. That's what you do. But what happens is you run into the limits of what the efficiency gains can be. They're physics limits. That's what's happened now. We've sort of wrung out all the low hanging fruit, so to speak, out of efficiency gains in most things, from air conditioners to heaters to lighting, to a great extent to many aspects of computing. So now you're entering a new era. So what do we do? Well, we have to produce more electricity. That's we don't have we don't have a lot of options, uh, or they'll go elsewhere. So this gets to your question about distributing the data centers. Where could I put them? So simplistically speaking, there's two kinds of tasks. Well, there's tasks that can be done anytime. For example, if I want to store your videos or your pictures that you take, of your family and friends and kids and whatever. It doesn't really matter that much if the cloud storage is in Iceland or in Reykjavik, Iceland, or whether it's in Pavagnatuk, you know, Northwest Territories. It makes a matter because you can access it in a half a second or so. And the latency is not offensive. It's not that speed of light's pretty good. Um, but if you want to run video in real time, streaming video, which is what people are, then you latency of a half a second gives you video jitter. So all that stuff has to be pushed to the edges of the network in local data centers so that they can stream to you without jitter with lots of data, high bandwidth stuff. So it depends on the task. A lot of if you try to do a calculation, you during machine learning, I want to teach a machine learning model how to recognize diseases better than an old model. I can have all the data in a data center anywhere on the planet and let it run wherever it's cheapest. Once it's done the learning task, wherever it's cheap and easier, I can then port that learned model where it can be used. So that can be done anywhere. But anything that has to be done in real time or latency matters, which is computing and so anything that has to do with real world automation, anything that has to do with things like video, things like we're doing now with Zoom, latency matters because you get all that jitter and freezing, and it's not only unacceptable as like a consumer product, it can be lethal if it's automating a machine that is interacting with a person, whether it's automating a car remotely or an aircraft. And I think the ultimate self-driving cars will end up being controlled not by computers in the car, but by computers on the edge of the network, close to the car, not a long way away cloud, nearby cloud, because then you can put lots of computing horsepower with low latency very close to the vehicles, and then you can have functionally infinite amount of compute power. So the application will determine it. What will happen is there'll be applications for everything. The model for a network, including the cloud, is what some analysts have called the peach model. Right, the things on the edge are on the surface of the peach, the fuzz, and in the middle there's the meat, and at the core is the pit. As the peach grows, everything gets bigger, but geometrically the surface gets bigger faster. So there's far more applications for compute on the edge with light compute, AI in your device, AI in your headset, AI in the thermometer, AI in your refrigerator. These lightweight chips, so to speak, in energy terms, can perform rudimentary AI tasks on the edge. But anything that's a heavy lift, doing anything to do with healthcare, anything with basic research, anything analytical, the compute horsepower you need in general and for AI is so huge that you can't use a single AI chip to do it. You're using hundreds of thousands of AI chips. Well, you can do. It's not hard to figure out if a single AI chip, single GPU, and a card consumes 1.5 to 2 kilowatts. Typical small Canadian house is 2 kilowatts. A mid-sized house is 4 kilowatts peak. Big house, let's call it 5. So if I have a card, and a computing card, as you probably know, maybe your audience knows, it's like this. Think of it as like a stripped away laptop without a case around it, something like that. But if I have one of those at 2 kilowatts, and that's might have 4 GPUs on it, but I need 10,000 GPUs. I can do the arithmetic here. I got a rack with 100 of them. So now I'm at 100 kilowatts in something the size of a refrigerator in your kitchen, 100 kilowatts. And then I put 1,000 of them in a building called a data center. Now I'm at 100 megawatts. This is why the nuclear debate has been reignited. We're building data centers, each one of which uses as much electricity as can be produced by a small nuclear power plant. So now you have all the tech guys saying, "Oh, gee, well, maybe we should buy nuclear power plants to run our data centers." I say, "Well, okay,
Right. And we're even hearing of gigawatt scale data centers.
yeah, sure."
There was an interesting deal
Gigawatts
between
a big number.
It is a big number. It is a big number. And so yeah, you're saying nuclear's back. I mean, there's lots of talk now of obviously the tech bros in Silicon Valley. Sam Altman imagining that fusion is going to be that energy revolution that will power those data centers. Talk of advanced nuclear. It seems like, given the immaturity of that sector and how long it takes, the inertia to develop it, we're looking at uprates of existing facilities. We're looking at bringing 3 Mile Island Unit 1, the one that didn't melt down, back online, that was shut down for economic reasons just 5 years ago, I believe in 2019, due to cheap natural gas prices. Um, it is a pretty extraordinary turnaround, and I think one element of that is the power quality issues. PJM is retiring tens of gigawatts of coal and gas over the next decade. I think our vertically integrated monopoly utilities, it probably built a pretty healthy capacity in there. And we've had pretty reliable power as a result. We're shaving that down. We're redlining, and reliable power. Baseload's back, baby. That's what it sounds like. So what do you think the risks are of well-capitalized tech companies being able to sign above market PPAs and basically gobble up all of that reliable nuclear electricity and leave some of the the lower quality power for the rest of us proles?
Yeah, let you deal with the lights being out and the refrigerator not working or your air conditioner not
Yeah.
working in a heat wave. I would say in the electricity business, just like any energy business, what will happen in the future is what's happened in the past. Priority will be given to residences. That's what will happen. It just will happen. It's no politician is going to let uh, a permanent condition occur where the industrial sector gets energy before residences and citizens get it. It won't happen. At least not in a democracy. It can happen in Russia, but not here. And even there, they'd have trouble. So that won't be the trajectory. The trajectory will be to figure out how to make enough electricity. And if the industrial sector can't get the electricity they need, they'll go elsewhere, which is what's happening right now, by the way, in Germany. Germany is deindustrializing, as is the United Kingdom, because they're not building enough electric power plants that are reliable. So I'll make a couple predictions. First, the plans for shutting down coal and gas plants will stop. In fact, they'll probably reverse plans, as they already did in Germany. Uh, so I think you'll see, however it's packaged politically, the temporary pause, extension, whatever the language is. Well, we're going to stop shutting down reliable power plants because the modus operandi in North America, so up the last 15 years, has been to shut down existing reliable power plants, which would be nuclear power, coal, and gas, and replace them with unreliable power plants, wind and batteries, and solar. What will happen going forward is we'll do both, because if you have electric demand growth, you're going to build both. You're not going to do one or the other, which is the operation of the last decade. Just not sustainable. So you're right. The data center can't run on episodic power, and if they could, and they thought episodic windmills were just fine with batteries, they'd buy the batteries. It, instead of trying to convince governments to force utilities to buy big batteries to keep the grid lit, if the technorati really believe that wind and solar and batteries combined are cheaper than conventional grids, they can go ahead, disconnect from the grid, and build those and run their data centers on that. And they're not. Okay, what they're doing is they're buying a shell game of funding windmills in Europe and elsewhere to get credits that they can say we're running our data center on green energy. When they are doing it legally, it's a legally allowed credit, but the data center is not running on those wind turbines. Obviously, it's running on whatever grid it's connected to, and that grid typically, certainly in North America, is 70% powered by hydrocarbons. If you're in Ontario, you got a lot more nukes, and if you're in different parts of the United States, you got a lot more coal plants and more gas plants in other parts. So there's an interesting challenge. This is what this hearing was about that I mentioned. Utilities are now in a position where they cannot meet the demands that are coming for reliable power. Reliable means, as you know, not just uh, second by second and minute by minute, but hour by hour, but not just daily. But when there are wind droughts and solar droughts, and those large areas of the country are covered with clouds and there's no wind, when that happens, you can't cycle back data. You can turn them off. A lot of products and services will stop working. So you have to have a grid that's reliable, and you're going to need a grid that it's expanding. So both will have to happen. which means I think we're going to redound back to the reality that we have to do two things. One is short term, one is long term. In the short term, you have to stop shutting down power plants. Just you have to stop it and reactivate power plants that can be reactivated, whatever they are. And that's what's happened in Europe. They'll reactivate coal plants, nuclear plants if they haven't been decommissioned, and older gas. You need older gas plants, and you'll need to accelerate the construction of gas turbines, because in the short term, in the next 5 years, which is when this stuff is being built, there is a zero possibility. This is a bet I'd take happily with anybody, that we'll build another gigawatt to nuclear capacity, never mind 10 or 20 or 50 gigawatts in the next 5 years, or even 10 years. In the long term, we need to reinvigorate the supply chain, the capacities to build nuclear power plants at scale. And by that, I mean lots of little ones and lots of big ones, both. The new generation of small plants and the older generation of big plants. We have to build both. We're going to need both. But roughly speaking, decade to really animate that whole supply chain to build at scale. It's certainly possible in a couple of years we'll see the first of a kind of some new kinds of smaller nuclear power plants. That'll be exciting. They'll have to run them for a couple of years to see how they work, and then build a supply chain to start getting them up at scale. That'll take a few more years. So even on an accelerated basis, we're talking 5 to 7 years before you really begin to insert these power plants into the operation system, and then not at scales that matter. We're not talking tens of gigawatts. We need tens of gigawatts of new power plants in the United States and Canada, huge quantities. That'll have to come from. There's only one place. This is not rocket science. You can't build enough batteries to make that at any price. But even if you wanted to spend the money, the costs are astonishing. Combination of batteries and wind and solar to produce the reliable power is triple the cost of the nameplate price tag on these windmills. Because, as you know, I have to build 2 or 3 for each one in order to have the reliability plus enough extra electricity when they're operating to store for the non-operating times. And then I have to pay for batteries. When you do the arithmetic on that, you end up not with cheaper electricity. It is cheaper when the wind's blowing. But if you want electricity when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining, it's not cheaper. We know for a fact it's more expensive by 200 to 300%, so ballpark. So what do? Well, order nuclear plants. Great. I hope the tech industry orders a ton of them. That'd be wonderful. But you're not going to see any of them because nobody can build them at scale yet. What we know we can build rapidly are the gas-fired turbines or gas-fired naturally aspirated engines, so-called diesel engines at scale, can be built very quickly. They're incredibly thermodynamic efficient, burn natural gas, not diesel oil. You can dual fuel them, so you could arbitrage fuel on a price basis. But if one were taking a bet, it would be that we're not going to want to avoid having the economic opportunities associated with growth of whether it's EVs that people might want to buy. I think millions more than we sold yet. New factories to build chips. Chip fabs by themselves are incredibly electric intensive. One industry in Taiwan, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, uses 1/5 of all of Taiwan's electricity. One company. So we want to replicate that here. Great, you go, girls. But you're gonna have to build power plants. This is true in Taiwan too. And so I think we're going to be forced back into a reality-based energy posture, where we'll have a more realistic view of the need for nuclear power, and its manageable risks are extraordinarily manageable with well-designed power plants. But that'll take time. We're going to stop closing coal plants and have a different timeline for that. We still think that they should be closed. Change the timeline till you build enough alternative power. And then we're going to build as the Irish would say, a shite load of gas turbines in the next 5 years. That's what's going to happen.
Is that starting to happen, like in Texas and the Permian, where natural gas prices have been negative? They're just trying to deal with that excess production. Okay, yeah. I mean, it's hot
also
there,
happening
but I guess the fuel costs are.
in Germany. I mean, Germany has just passed a law to build a huge flight of gas turbines because this is a contemporaneous with they used to get cheap gas from Russia. They still get a lot of gas from Russia. They have to switch their sources of gas, but they're not rushing to build a massive new fleet of wind turbines. I mean, there's a message in this.
Don't forget, these are hydrogen-ready gas turbines, Mark. Don't be a cynic now.
You want to take that bet, huh? Well,
No, sir, I do not.
Strictly speaking, since words are elastic, they are burning hydrogen because, as you know, natural gas, methane, is CH4, and so there are more hydrogen molecule atoms in the not by weight but by count. So for every molecule, right, of gas, you have 80% is hydrogen. So technically speaking, as soon as they turn them on, they're burning hydrogen. So this is good. And that's what they're going to stick with because there's no path to make hydrogen as cheap as natural gas. It's all PowerPoint presentations. So no one is going to want to pay.
Even on Canada's East Coast, we won't be able to do it. We've got a new report on that. I'll send it along to you. In terms of I guess kind of the aesthetics of energy, and a lot of the tech bros are talking about small modular reactors, having them physically on site. Maybe they're not the ones managing them, but this, I guess, a temptation for kind of a behind the meter approach, and maybe that has to do with fears of pitchfork wielding residents, or that kind of competition for grid power. I'm pretty skeptical about smaller scale nuclear in general, but do you think that's what's driving some of those choices or preferences to get behind the meter, to avoid that competition?
Behind the meter stuff's been around for a long time in the industrial sector, and there's sort of a dividing line. As soon as it's an industry where the power plants you need are utility scale, this is true in the refining industry, chemical industry, then building power plants behind the fence makes sense because you're just basically operating like a utility. And there's no reason you can't hire the same people utility hires. So if you need 100 megawatts, 200 megawatts, 300 megawatts of power, and you happen to also need steam, which is true for a lot of industries, it makes a lot of sense to be behind the fence, build your own power plant. It makes more sense not to have that hassle because it's another management vertical. So that's why the model you mentioned becomes more popular, where you provide the site and an external owner operator operates the power plant on your site for your exclusive use. And that's the conversation that's going on around nukes. I think that'll happen, by the way. I think a nuclear owner operator will successfully, very likely, build nuclear power plants for data centers inside the fence line for a data center, and maybe build two of them when they need one, and then sell power back to the grid. I mean, who knows? Would not surprise me because it's going to. Which is the right solution will depend totally on where the data center is, right? Because it may be if you're near a robust grid and you have a partner that can put the power plants inside of what amounts to a distribution substation, why would you put them on your site? So there's going to be all kinds of models going forward, just as there have been in the past. But I do think there'll be some new nuclear power plants built, and I think they'll be financed by data centers. I think that's a good thing. We'll get experience. But overall, generally speaking, what we've learned after 100 years of building power plants and electric grids in the Western world is that the central utility model is overall cheaper, overall more reliable. You don't necessarily get high reliability by distributing power plants. You can, it's possible, but on average, not for really big. When you're talking about hundreds of gigawatts of power, it's not a good solution. So it'll be a niche solution. Your skepticism on small nuclear power plants, I used to share, but I'm changed my mind a little bit. But it depends on the timelines. If you want to build nuclear power plants now, if governments want more nuclear, they need to order what we know how to build. Obviously, we know how to build gigawatt scale power plants, half to 1 gigs, and there's no mystery to it. China's building them right now. One was just finished, the 2 unit in Finland, South Korea. The Russians are building them, as you probably know. Second biggest exporter of nuclear power plants is Russia after China. French are going to build a bunch more. We could do the same in Canada and the United States. If you want to build them, put the order in today. There's designs. We know they work. Start building them. This would be great. To get the small reactors to be competitive for their applications, And I think there's markets for thousands of tens of thousands of small reactors, ranging, call it 10 megawatts to 100 megawatts. So that's those scales. Uh, just as in aviation, if you look at the aviation industry as a model, it's similar to power plant industry because they build power plants. It's the same thing. In fact, the aeroderivative turbines on a jet aircraft are exactly the same as the gas turbines. Are stationary in principle. Uh, what you find is there's a dominant size for an aircraft power plant. It's based on the optimal infrastructure and logistics around that industry, which turns out to be a 25 to 50 megawatt power plant. That's what a typical engine is for a 737. But we make lots of bigger engines for a smaller number of aircraft and lots of smaller engines for smaller aircraft. Uh, you're going to, I think, in the nuclear power world, the optimal, I'm going to guess, is going to be something like a 500 megawatt unit, 300 to 500 megawatt, configured as gigawatt scale reactors. And you're going to see that dominate, like the 737, A320s dominate aviation. But there's still a huge market for lots of other applications. And there are no nuclear power plants to speak of that are filling those market niches. So I think that will happen. It'll just take longer because we have to establish the supply chain capabilities to manufacture those things at scale. And no one has manufactured any of them at scale ever. It's never, it doesn't, you talk to engineers, they'll tell you how to do it. Okay, go. But you need money, you need to build the factories, you need qualified welders, qualified electricians, that whole supply chain doesn't exist yet to build at scale. I think it'll come. And I think you're going to see mobile transportable reactors. They've been around for a long time. It's not a new idea. Space program needs them, by the way. NASA has the Da Vinci reactor, which they want to put on Mars. Mars is too far away for solar power to be useful at scale. So you're going to want nukes. You're going to need nuclear power plants to push rockets to Mars fast enough. Chemical rockets aren't going to work. You've got use in the subsurface in the oil and gas industry. There are certainly lots of applications where you would like to put data centers, to your point, where we're going to store data and process data, where it'll be nice and cool, but there's not a lot of electricity. It'd be nice to have a power plant that you can turn on and refuel it every 10 years. And these are very nice features. So I think all that happens, but if you look at the supply chain, the timelines for engineering qualifications, a decade plus, but the world 2 decades from now will look very different in terms of the number of kinds of nuclear reactors. But my admonition would be for the nuclear bulls, and you see this a lot in the United States now, where some states that banned new nuclear power plants are passing legislation to allow construction of new modular small reactors. Okay, they're passing laws that allow you to build what we don't know how to build. The worthless law.
Yeah. And they won't let you build the big stuff in Illinois. Yeah,
right. It's crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to chat a little bit about, I guess, some of the geostrategic implications of the cloud and of AI. There was talk of a missile gap in the 60s and 70s. I don't know how long that went on for, but is there like the potential of a compute gap if we can't keep up in terms of powering or building this infrastructure, or is that not something we need to be so worried about?
Part of the trope that has been run out is that if we don't build the data centers, AI data centers, and power them, that China is willing to power theirs because they're building lots of coal plants, and they're, as you know, they not only built a lot, they're building a lot. So there's going to be lots of cheap electricity in China for a long time. So it's not going to be hard for them to build AI-based data centers and power them inexpensively. But it's a silly argument. We're not going to not build power plants because of the climate change movement. It's so wrapped around their axle over building power plants that are useful. That is the power data centers 24/7. We're not going to abandon it. I just don't believe it. It's just not going to happen. I mean, it's a lot of debate over the implications of, set aside the debate over climate change. I'm just saying the motivation for opposing power plants is climate change. Obviously, people want to avoid building power plants that burn hydrocarbons. Okay, if you don't build them, you're not going to have enough electricity. I mean, it's just a fact. You'll either build them and have enough electricity, or you won't. I don't think the United States and Canada are going to decide a future with not enough electricity is acceptable. It's just not going to happen. It might take a few blackouts in Canada and the United States to get citizens unhappy about it, and then politicians will pay attention quickly, and we'll build power plants again. So I think if we actually push it to that point, it'll get resolved very quickly. I think it gets resolved before we get the blackouts. I think people don't are afraid enough of blackouts that when grid operators come to a governor or to a premier and tell them you're going to have blackouts if you shut that down, that they'll back off because it's not a political statement. These are engineers. You're going to go dark. Next time there's a heat wave, we're going to be cycling like happened in Alberta recently, right? It's not going to be pleasant. So I don't think that's the issue. The different issue is there a race because of AI's existential threats or benefits between China and the United States to get the AI supremacy? Or that language could China beat us to AI supremacy? Well, Chinese engineers are really smart. I went to maybe 12 or 14 cities in China over 2 or 3 visits, not recently, but about 5, 6 years ago. Yeah, there's no question. There's the great engineers, and they build impressive things. Not just commodity stuff. They rockets. Their rockets work. The GPS works. Their ships work. Their airplanes work. They're building Boeing competing airplanes soon. So I think they're serious competition. I think just generally speaking, and this is not meant as a cultural statement, it's just an operational reality. New stuff like AI, when compute is new, when technologies are new and different, in order to wring out of it what its utility is and have industries know how to build those things, because nobody knows exactly what to do with it yet. It's pretty clear, right? Nobody knows exactly what should be built. And there's not going to just be an NVIDIA. There's going to be there's at least 2 dozen non-public GPU makers that are making GPUs that claim to be, probably are better than NVIDIA's GPUs. Impressive things that are coming. Almost all of them are here in North America. Most of them are in the United States, not in China. There's a few there, but most of them are here. So we're sort of at 1980 in compute. And I say that because in 1980, after President Reagan was elected, the Japanese were going to launch a massive effort to leapfrog the United States in compute. Now, computers at that time, 1980, for those of a certain age, will remember this is 4 years before the Apple Mac, when the Apple IIe had been out. So personal computers were, toys and cute, but by and large, the compute world was dominated by mainframes. And Japan was going to leapfrog us, and that's not what happened. What happened is the era of personal computing exploded in the United States because nobody ordered it, directed it. It wasn't a government program. It was just this ebullient industry of capital and entrepreneurs. AI is going to be exactly the same way. What we do with it, what kind of chips, what kind of applications. So we're sort of like, maybe it's not 1980, maybe it's 1984, right? When the first Mac, which looks really clunky in hindsight if you go back and look at it. But then,
oh yeah,
I mean, people were blown away. I mean, a little box on your desk instead of this giant stuff. So it's hard to get your head around how incredibly exciting that was in 1980 and 1984. So we're excited about ChatGPT and what AI is doing. It's 1984. I mean, we haven't even begun to ring out and innovate and fund these things. China's not good at those things. It's good at a lot of things, but that's not its business culture. Its political culture is not as good as the United States, and I don't mean this as a jingoistic sense, or as good as Canada's. I mean, BlackBerry came out of Canada. It's just not as good, and it's regressed with the political environment in China right now. They've had a regression, pulling away from free market incentives there, and you really have to function in a sort of quasi-chaotic, capitalist risk-taking environment to figure out what's going to be next, something as remarkably different as AI. That's a long way of saying I'm not worried at all about losing the AI supremacy war to China. I think that's the only way that'll happen is if we Sovietize our economies here, if we do complete command and control. It's not, I mean, it's possible. I mean, I don't know. Your prime minister kind of sort of seems like he wants to do a lot of command and control. Maybe Canada won't participate. And our president is sort of leans more towards command and control. I don't know. I think it's unlikely. I don't think this is where Canada and the United States are very similar. I mean, I worked as a scientist and engineer in both countries, and culturally, people do this kind of innovating in an environment a lot more like we have in North America than exists in China, and even more than exists in a lot of Europe right now. Europe is sort of slipping They have extraordinary engineers in Europe, no question, but uh, they are, I think, making epic mistakes at the moment. They're reversible. They might reverse them. I'm not talking about social mistakes. I'm talking about epic industrial planning mistakes. And the more we drift into industrial planning, and the firmer it gets in the sense that the governments are deciding the path for innovation, the path for investment, the less likely you'll get real innovation, because the people who are doing the planning are by definition bureaucrats. And I don't mean to insult bureaucrats. I know lots of very capable, bright bureaucrats, but that's not where innovation happens. It just isn't, and it's never been the case.
Let's talk in the time we have left. You're comparing us to sort of being where we were in the 80s, inferring that there is just an enormous amount of growth potential in the sector. You said before that appetite for information is essentially insatiable, unlike the appetite for calories, for instance. You had an interesting anecdote in one of your recent papers, just walking through the prefixes of numbers. Starting with the kilo in 1795, the mega in 1873, and we're up in the era of the zeta. Can you just give us a sense of the sheer size that we're talking about? And then I really want to chat a little bit about in silico, talking about some of the novel applications that this degree of compute and AI are going to open up for us.
You're right. In my book and one recent article, I sort of thought that one way to think about how we have to measure everything we do. We just humans we count what we do, right? We count miles, we count pounds, we count ounces, we count, and we've had numbers for a long time. But it was interesting to me when I was doing research for my book to find that the creation of names for big numbers, because we have to count things, sort of tracks technology progress for obvious reasons. You don't need the prefix million if you don't make or count a million of anything. If everything you're counting is in thousands, for practical reasons, you don't need a bigger name. So when I looked across the history of names for big numbers, there's a long gap before we started naming really big numbers for not just billions but trillions and quadrillions. And of course, the prefixes are these odd. People know gigabytes, but after gigabyte, terabyte, and then you got to get the a petabyte and the exabyte. But each increment is 1,000-fold, as you know. And then after exabyte, that's where we get the zettabyte. And that's a big number. So all the data trackers throw around this word, we're in the zettabyte era. By that they mean there's around 50 zettabytes of data moving around the cloud collectively. It's managed, moved, and shuffled about. And it makes it sound small because it's 50, 50, it's 50 zettabytes. We used to be in an era where, you and I remember when people would brag about going from a memory device that stored kilobytes to I have a megabyte. Then you got a gigabyte storage. Like, whoa, that's a billion bytes. Now you can buy terabyte flash drives. It's crazy, trillion. But each increment is big. And the reason it was interesting to me is that, of course, in the physics of energy, we know a lot about how much energy is associated with each byte. Every byte involves an energy transaction. It's just the law of nature. There's a transaction, an energy transaction to create the byte. And then there's an energy transaction to move it, just like people. And then there's an energy transaction to store it. But a byte is infinitesimal. You can store, a byte can be literally a countable number of electrons, utterly crazy, tiny volume, tiny amount of energy. But you're moving lots of them. So I just did arithmetic with the obvious, the calculator. Is that how would I visualize a zettabyte? We're a 50 zettabyte economy in data terms. And of course, the answer is, if you a stack of bills, dollar bills, you stacked up them till you got a zettabyte worth, it would go to the sun and back, which is 93 million miles away, 700,000 times. So there's a big, it's like, wow. I mean, this is such a big number. How do you visualize a number? And now we're talking about, to your point, which I've said over and over again in my writings, the only product humans have ever created with an infinite demand potential is data. Because there's no limit to how much we want to know about something, or how much we want to count, how much we want to measure, how granular we want to measure it, how much precision we need, the velocity. So there's just no limit. It's just purely based on what you can imagine. Whereas everything else has a limit. There's only so many pounds of food you can eat. Doesn't matter what you imagine is only so fast you can fly. Only big you build a house, it'll crush it. Everything has those limits, but information, weirdly, the actual quantity. So the next number after zeta, 1,000 zetas, which will be is a yotta, Y-O-T-T-A. So we're going to be in the yottabyte era before this decade's out, for sure. I think we'll get there way before the decade's out. So the the Bureau of International Measurements and Names and Measurements came up with new names for a number after that, because what's happened over the centuries is the bureaucrats come up with a name in advance of us needing it, which is pretty useful. They actually have some utility. And after zettabyte is a yottabyte, and after yottabyte will be the ronnabyte, R-O-N-N-A, which is really, as you may recall, I wrote in my book. When my book came out, they hadn't chosen the name yet, and all the computer guys wanted it to be called a brontobyte after the brontosaurus because it would sound cool. But the humorless French bureaucrats wouldn't do that, so they named it a ronnabyte because it's just the prefix means something in Greek and whatever. I was disappointed, but it is fascinating that we have to invent names for numbers to accommodate the magnitude of demand for data. It's crazy, and numbers that are so big. One other context: 50 zettabytes. All the molecules of the atmosphere of the Earth weigh, I think, 3 zettagrams. The whole atmosphere of the planet Earth, if you measure it in zetas, weighs 3 zettagrams. I mean, zeta is a really big number. So this is why when I say the cloud is the biggest infrastructure ever built by humanity, yeah, think about it. We built an infrastructure to move a quantity of things that are real. Bytes are real things, maybe tiny, but they're real. They have physical existence. The virtual world has physical existence and machinery, and electrons and charges. And we're doing this at the zettabyte level, and we're on our way to a yottabyte level. This is crazy. I mean, it has all kinds of fascinating implications for infrastructure and power. And I'm not talking about what do you do with it. That's what the book's a lot about. More, what do you do with this power? Right. This is the part that's fascinating. As you know, trying to predict. You give that much horsepower in compute sense. So what are people going to do with it? What I mean, it's not like you can predict easily. There'll be all kinds of. No one predicted the quote sharing economy in the You Got Mail days. Everybody's slobbering about how exciting it was to do email, that you could go to a website and do email. Wow, you got mail. Get a movie, you got mail. No one then said we're going to have the Uber economy and sharing economy and Rover, where you can disintermediate service functions and create all kinds of new business models. No one thought about that. The equivalent to that kind of surprise will surely come as we expand the cloud and amplify it with AI.
So tell us about in silico. We've heard about in vitro research. This sounds like a novel application that's only unleashed by the sheer amount of compute power. That just caught my eye as a medical professional. So you've done a bit more research on this. I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, no, as you know, I said this in my book, and I still believe it's true. We're a long, long way away from computing, replicating the artistic skill that comes with being a physician. Because we don't know how the human brain works. It's not a computer. It doesn't. It's computer models. It doesn't work like AI. In fact, AI isn't. Artificial intelligence isn't intelligent. It's it's a very different neural network class of compute that emulates inference, but it's not a human brain. It doesn't think like a brain. It doesn't work. But it doesn't matter. The point, though, is some functions of medicine, some features are reducible to compute questions. This is what's true, of course, for some diagnostics, especially one of the most difficult things as a physician is if you do things that are repetitive a lot, human beings get into cognitive dissonance. It just happens, which is why you have a consult with somebody else. You just look at this X-ray too many times or MRI, and you have somebody else look at the same thing, and they'll say you missed that. And you go, how did that happen? Well, because humans have cognitive dissonance. So machines can help on that. They can actually help you see things that you miss, just as a co-consult can, but only if they're astonishingly powerful. I mean, really astonishing. The amount of data sets, and they have to operate more like AI because you're not looking for compute, you're looking for inference. You're not looking for 1 + 1 = 2, but those two things don't look like they're close to two. They look like they're close. It's how automated steering works. It's not on a track. This is about right. So as you get to a greater ability to gather data, so let's use the human body as the example, we're seeing phenomenal advances in the size and the precision of sensors that gather data about biological functions, human body functions, not just MRI and CAT scans merge, but the whole constellation of data. Problem is it's a data storm. You're looking for patterns in it, and it's a data set different than you as a human are used to. AI in principle, and the principle is not crazy. You can imagine AI and a compute capacity to hold a massive data set of what we know about my own body. Now, I'm not going to know everything about my body, but I can begin to imagine collecting not just terabytes, but petabytes worth of data about my personal body. This is not right now. It's too expensive. If I wanted to store a petabyte, I get into a cost that most people would not find acceptable. You store terabytes, you and I, constantly, because that's what you have on a flash drive. But remember, tera is a tiny number. When you got to go up 1,000-fold. So if something costs $1, now you do $1,000. That's the kind of, but that cost will come down. So as the cost of memory and storage and compute comes down, and it's coming down at the same rate now as it has been for a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades. So now I can begin to think about a computer that has a massive quantity of data, not just about my body from I've gone to a diagnostic test in a hospital, but I'm collecting real-time data. I mean, you have this as a physician. We both subject ourselves to our doctors, and you're not feeling well. And the question is, well, you eat anything different in the last few weeks, or what did what did you get? You get questions about the past that you can't answer. But it's not crazy to collect that kind of real-time data about yourself, stored in a secure cloud environment about yourself continually, so that you can have a cloud twin, your body, your information in a sense. It's not a true twin, but they talk about this as twins. So that all the data, not just about a diagnostic test was taken a year ago or 10 years ago, or one I took yesterday, but all of the biological data that I've been collecting about myself, including my walking and my steps, my respiration, my sleep, body movements actually matter. As you know, there's been some very good AI-based research that's shown that if I use a motion sensor, I just use the motion sensor that's in an iWatch, the change in how you use your arms is a decent indicator of a certain types of disease onset. And they're very subtle changes in your motor neural functions, but you don't see them, but they're subtle enough that over time, an AI can pick them up. All those kinds of things going into a computer in silico, in silicon, means that I can do two things in the future, one sooner than later. One of them would be, well, the answer to the question. You go to your doctor, you use your password and say, you can take a look at my in silico digital twin, and get answers to lots of questions. My blood sugar level 2 weeks ago, because you could imagine swallowing a pill every day. Your vitamin will have in it a smart sensor that's biodegradable that will upload data about your GI system daily to your smartphone. Why wouldn't you do that if it was $1 a day? And it's not that kind of technology is known. This is not speculative fiction. My whole book is about the future is predictable from what's already invented, but not commercialized. What I just described already exists. Biodegradable silicon that can do sensing and measuring already exists, already being put to work. So as those things advance, I now have an in silico digital twin that can answer a lot of the questions about my state of health in the past that a physician can look at, not in combination with an AI, because the AI is going to look for patterns, changes in patterns, and advise the doctor. Say, I noticed this. Did you what? And then you look at the data set and say, well, it's AI is hallucinating because it's irrelevant, or maybe I didn't notice that. Further down the pike, of course, the holy grail of in silico is to do full drug testing in silico, because I have enough precision about my biome, my personal physiology, my personal history. You as a physician know that all the off-label uses for drugs are discovered ex post facto, They're discovered because they have beneficial effects nobody thought about. In some cases, they have toxic effects on certain people, but therapeutic effects on others. We don't typically know who's it's toxic for, who it's therapeutic for. With sufficient amount of data, one believes, and it's not a crazy belief because we have reasonable science on this, that I would be able to tell if a specific therapeutic was toxic or beneficial to you, whether it's for cancer or for a virus. And that kind of in silico testing, because the how that virus behaves, how the therapeutic behaves, it can be modeled. And because GPUs and AI can model real dynamic things, not static things, we can come close to modeling interactions of drugs. And a lot of drug discovery now is amplified by those kinds of modeling. So they're using supercomputers to do drug discovery and modeling in silico before they then go into animal trials. Once you know that's happening, and it's expensive today, it's in a supercomputer, it doesn't take any imagination to say, well, okay, that can be democratized. It might take 10 years, but it'll get democratized because it'll become cheap. Once it's cheap, then we're into a whole different era of what the precision medicine, which has always been the holy grail, but it's really about hyperspecificity. As you know, this is what you deal with every day. Is what I'm doing right for that patient. And if wouldn't it be great if some in silico AI could at least give you a heads up on risks for that person that you might not have noticed? This, I think, profoundly improve, to put it in cold economic terms, the productivity of medicine. Wouldn't it? I mean, fewer bad outcomes, faster
Sure
good
use it.
outcomes.
Yeah.
But I think I don't think
Mark,
that's
it's funny.
difficult to predict.
Yeah. No, I talk to my physician colleagues sometimes, and they always assume I have a medical podcast. And I think this is the most medicine I've spoken in the 4 years of making this podcast. So appreciate that interlude. We're gonna have to park it here. Definitely want to have you back much sooner than previous. Hopefully in the next month or two. You're doing lots of great writing on EVs. There's a lot of talk about battery overcapacity right now and the falling price of batteries. We did an episode before, batteries and energy, Lysenkoism. We've had a lot of fun, Mark. Same today, and looking forward to having you back again soon.
Be great to come back. We can talk batteries next time. It'll be a lot of fun.
Beautiful.